You know what though? I think sometimes I'm more interested in the statistical reality that's way less that's way more difficult. Do you know all the communist countries? I do, in fact. If we're speaking about like the definitions of socialism and communism and stuff, the answer would be zero. There are no communist countries, nor have there ever been, because communism means a stateless society. But with respect to like the Eastern Bloc and that sort of thing, the countries that call themselves currently communist, that would be, let's see, I know China does. North Korea, on paper, has the thinnest veneer of that. And then there's a couple other ones that call themselves communist, not socialist, but communist. I forget what they are, though. It might even just be those two. I think all the other countries that would bear that label now. Oh, there are 5 that currently call themselves communist. Okay, so I got 2 of them. Cuba, you might be able to fit with them, but I'm pretty sure Cuba calls itself socialist, and they adhere to socialist principles more than the other, like, quote-unquote communist countries. There's a hell of problems in Cuba, but they're one of the few countries that I can say is genuinely trying. Something like it, I didn't know what this was based on. Communism be confusing sometimes. Yeah, I know that, like, the Eastern Bloc countries, back in the day when, you know, what called themselves communists was, you know, Iron Curtain, it would have been Czechoslovakia, Poland, like, Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, the Baltics, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Moldova, Romania, Bulgaria, and like Yugoslavia. That's the Eastern Bloc back in the day. And then there was the Sino-Soviet split, but they both still called themselves communist. Nowadays, it's let's see, China, North Korea, maybe Cuba, and I would bet somebody in Central Asia, but not 100% sure. And maybe there's like one country in Africa that still does, but frankly, Africa is so politically unstable as a product of colonialism that, like, what any ruling party's ideology is on paper doesn't count for much. Unless you're in, like, Northern Africa, then it kind of counts because these are more stable countries. Libya being an exception to that. It's Cuba in the Americas, and then it's all Asia. China, North Korea, Vietnam, and Laos. Okay, yeah, that's right. Vietnam still calls itself communist, despite being just basically a social democracy. Which, I mean, is good given the position they were in before. So yeah, Cuba calls itself communist. China calls itself communist. Vietnam and Laos call themselves communist, and North Korea calls itself communist. Okay. In reality, if I could actually I'd take a moment, this is something that's interesting to me, lay out the proper, what is more accurately the organizing principle in these countries. It wouldn't be communism because, again, stateless society. In China, they are capitalist. It's basically just a super authoritarian version of, like, what the rest of the world does. The US, you know, especially, you know, being the other economic power. You know, it's an unelected one-party state. There are billionaires. Businesses are owned privately, but it's controlled by the state. That is called fascism. And, you know, a lot of times people use fascism to refer to, like, vaguer, like, social movements. This is, like, a textbook definition of fascism or state capitalism, where the power of the state and the power of private enterprise have been rolled together under the control of the state. Surprised they didn't count Nepal in, because there have been 73 political parties in Nepal that were called the Communist Party of Nepal. Yeah, I mean, countries don't always call themselves communist whenever the Communist Party or the Socialist Party gets in power. For example, the Socialist Party in France has been in power on several occasions, and France hasn't really called itself a socialist country. Similar thing with the Socialist Party in Spain and in Portugal and in, you know, I would imagine the Netherlands at some point. You know, it tends to be like, if power is seized by means of revolution, usually that's when it happens. And I don't think Nepal has ever had a communist revolution. Not to my knowledge, anyways. I would have probably learned about that. Because India was loosely an ally of the U.S. in the Cold War, so I probably would have heard of that in history class. Anyways, politics boy, that explains a lot. Yeah, it's like the difference between there being prominent out of power communist movements and then a communist movement that is extremely central, or like a nominally communist party that's extremely central to the running of the state. Such is the case in China, even though, like I said, state capitalism, fascist party. North Korea is a, what's the term? Necrocracy? Ruled by dead person. It's a, like, hyper-authoritarian, like, totalitarian, dynastic rule country. It's just like a really, really bad monarchy. But they paint the, like, red star on a lot of things, so that, you know, they say, hey, look, we're communist because of the state controls everything, but that's not really the case. I don't even know to what extent private enterprise exists in North Korea, because it's so opaque with respect to data collection and journalism. It's kind of a unique case that we just don't know what goes on in there. At least, you know, if you get into the specifics. Generally speaking, you know, you can get an idea. Cuba, I would say, is actually, in some respects, socialist. Obviously, I think that they are capitalist insofar as every other country is, because they have to operate within the global economy. And they are authoritarian. There is only very limited democracy, and at the high levels of government, at the federal level in Cuba, there are many problems with corruption, with authoritarianism. There's not a whole lot of room for independent organization and association, you know, with respect to political parties and even unions at times. But at the local level, there is a significant degree of democracy that exists, and there are genuinely collectively owned sectors and industries. For example, the medical sector in Cuba, I believe, is collectively owned. It is collectively owned under the umbrella of the state, but what that means is basically it's a little bit different than nationalization, because no private health enterprise is actually allowed to exist in Cuba, as far as I know. So all of their medicine, all of their hospitals are public hospitals, funded by tax money and free at the point of service. That's why their healthcare is so good, because it's collectivized. And then, what were the other ones? Vietnam and Laos. I don't know hardly anything about Laos, so I will forgo comment on that. Vietnam is like a kind of middling social democracy. The communist movement in Vietnam took over the state, and then, as is the case with a lot of revolutions in that vein, where there's like, oh, communist movement wins and takes power. Through running a nation state and through having to fit to the nation state form, they ultimately just became not communist. And I think that was borne out pretty well through the mass killings of small farmers that owned their own land. I think there was a pretty big divide between the peasantry and the communist movement in Vietnam. I'd have to get really into the academics on that, but over time it became a social democracy, basically like a poorer version of what you would find in the Netherlands or Sweden or Norway or Finland. You know, same kind of principle. What are your thoughts on communism now that you're talking about it? I think communism is the ideal end state of human society if you're taking it at its philosophical definition. The definition of communism in, like, political philosophy is a stateless, classless, moneyless society. Now, that is not to say that these things once existed and then now you don't have them anymore. That is to say that there is no concept of either of these three things. You know, And the key thing about communism is just the elimination of any unjust hierarchies. Any status systems where you could basically do the thing of the society for putting things on top of other things. None of that. And ideally, in a communist society, you would have a vibrant democracy in all areas of life where you could feasibly apply it, in civil life, in economic life, in social life, such as the case with like collectively owning stuff. I think it's good. But at the same time, the label of communism is toxic, and I've recognized this over time. Because of all the countries that have borne the label of communist, but had basically nothing to do with communist principles of organization. The Soviet Union being the biggest one, China being another one. They were just a different kind of capitalist. Things were still owned privately. There was no democratic control over production, over the economy and whatever. It was all just run by the state acting like a private business unto itself. That's not very communist of them. So I think usually when I'm thinking about myself and what I support in terms of leftist politics, I think I usually prefer socialist as a label, because that's much easier to defend to a lot of people who would hear some Cold War stuff. The idea is generally the same. Socialism is when the means of production, the economy, are owned in common. When it's like when there's civil democracy and social democracy, but also economic democracy. When you have all three of those, that's socialism. And then when you theoretically, when you progress that all the way to its logical endpoint, where now there's no more state, there's no more concept of money, there's no more class separation, that is when you have achieved communism. This is the excuse me, I'm jumbling my words. This is a definition that Karl Marx operated off of. This is the definition that most serious theorists would operate off of, who are like trying to envision a socialist world. And the reason I say most serious theorists is that there are quite a few opportunistic folks like Stalin and Lenin who sort of twist the definitions of socialism and communism for more personally beneficial ends. Those are my thoughts on communism. The idea is good. And in fact, if you can put it into practice properly, if you can do socialism in a way that retains democratic values, which I think it actually has to in order to be socialism, that's good. And in fact, that's the next logical step for society to take. So now that we've started introducing democracy to various areas of life. But it is very possible for that process to go wrong, and it has gone wrong throughout history. And I think a lot of people also misuse the label. Those are my thoughts. Leftist meme. I know, I talked for a long time, but it's a very complicated subject. The one word has so much attached to it, both in terms of philosophical implications and in terms of baggage.